when I looked out my kitchen window that February morning and saw the mountain of filthy, sludge-covered snow blocking my entire backyard. I knew my peaceful life in Montpelier, Vermont, was about to get a whole lot more complicated. I'm Zachary Irving, and I'd been living in my modest 3-bedroom house on Maple Ridge Drive for 5 years. The property came with a significant piece of land behind it, about half an acre that backed up to a wooded area. I'd never formally joined the homeowners association that governed the neighborhood, and technically, I didn't have to. My house was built before the HOA was established, giving me what's called grandfathered status. I paid my property taxes directly to the city and kept to myself. That morning, the coffee in my hand nearly slipped from my grip as I stared at what had appeared overnight. The snow wasn't white and pristine like you'd expect in Vermont. It was gray-brown and streaked with what looked like motor oil, rock salt, and God knows what else. The pile stretched at least 30 feet wide and had to be 12 feet high in some spots. I threw on my boots and coat, stepping out into the bitter cold. The temperature hovered around 15 degrees, typical for mid-February in Vermont. As I trudged through the snow in my yard toward the massive pile, the stench hit me. It wasn't just snow. This was the runoff from the entire neighborhood's roads, mixed with sand, salt, automotive fluids, and chemical ice melt. My boots crunched through the frozen crust, and I could see rainbow-colored oil slicks frozen into the ice. "What the hell?" I muttered, pulling out my phone to take pictures. I walked around the entire perimeter of the dump, documenting everything. Dark stains marked where the snow had started to melt against my property, creating toxic-looking puddles that were seeping toward the tree line. I was still photographing when I heard the gate on the side of my house creak open. I turned to see Brenda Morrison, the HOA president, marching toward me with her usual self-righteous stride. Brenda was in her mid-50s, with a severely cropped blonde bob and the kind of pursed lips that suggested she'd been complaining about something for the past 30 years straight. "Good morning, Zachary," she called out, not a hint of warmth in her voice. "Brenda," I replied, gesturing at the mountain behind me. "Want to explain this?" She stopped a few feet away, crossing her arms over her puffy winter coat. "The HOA hired a snow removal company to clear the streets. They needed somewhere to put it. And you thought my property was appropriate? Well, you have all this unused land back here," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. The common areas were full, and this was the most practical solution. I felt my jaw tighten. "Did it occur to you to ask permission first? The HOA has certain rights when it comes to emergency situations. This winter has been particularly harsh, and we needed to act quickly for the safety of the residents." "I'm not part of your HOA, Brenda. You know that." She waved a dismissive hand. "A technicality. You benefit from living in this neighborhood. You should contribute like everyone else. Contributing is not the same as you dumping toxic waste on my property without permission." I held up my phone, showing her the photos. "Look at this. There's oil, chemicals, road salt. This isn't just snow. Don't be dramatic. It's snow from plowing operations. It'll melt in the spring and go where? Into the groundwater, into the woods. This is contaminated material, Brenda." Her face hardened. "I don't appreciate your tone. The HOA acted within its rights, and quite frankly, you should be thanking us for maintaining the roads that you also use. Get it off my property. It'll melt. I want it removed now." Brenda's lips pressed into an even thinner line. "That's not happening." The snow removal company was hired for plowing, not hauling. Where exactly do you expect them to take it? The dump won't accept it, and it would cost thousands of dollars to move. That sounds like a you problem, not a me problem. I'll be taking this up with the HOA board. Your attitude is exactly why people in this neighborhood find you difficult." She turned on her heel and marched back toward the gate. I stood there in the cold, staring at the massive pile of contaminated snow, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. This was going to be a problem, a big one. Over the next few days, I did my research. I contacted the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation and spoke with a very helpful woman named Patricia, who explained the regulations around snow dumps. What Brenda had dismissed as harmless was actually classified as potential hazardous waste. The runoff from plowed roads contained petroleum products, heavy metals from brake dust, road salt, and various chemicals from ice melt products. When concentrated in large piles, it became an environmental concern. Patricia told me that unauthorized dumping of such material could result in significant fines, and that property owners could be held liable for contamination if they knowingly allowed it to remain. She also mentioned that I could file a formal complaint, but suggested I try to resolve it with the responsible party first. I drafted a letter to the HOA board, outlining the situation and requesting immediate removal of the snow pile. I cited specific Vermont environmental regulations and included my documentation of the contamination. I kept a copy for myself and sent it certified mail to ensure they couldn't claim they never received it. The response came a week later. I recognized Brenda's handwriting on the envelope before I even opened it. Inside was a single-page letter on HOA letterhead, stating that the board had reviewed my complaint and found it to be without merit. They maintained that the placement of the snow was a temporary emergency measure and that I was being unreasonable. The letter concluded by suggesting that if I had concerns about being a good neighbor, perhaps I should consider joining the HOA and participating in community decisions. I read it 3 times, each time feeling my blood pressure rise a little more. They weren't going to do anything. They'd made that crystal clear. That evening, I called my buddy Marcus Chen, who worked in environmental remediation over in Burlington. We'd gone to the University of Vermont together and stayed close over the years. I explained the situation over the phone. "Man, that's messed up," Marcus said. "They can't just dump contaminated snow on your property." "Apparently they can because they already did." "Have you thought about getting it tested? If you can document the contamination levels, you'd have a stronger case." "How much would that cost?" "For a proper hazmat assessment, probably a couple $1,000. But here's the thing, if it comes back hot with contaminants, you could potentially hold them liable for cleanup costs. And professional hazmat cleanup for that volume would run them way more than they spent on plowing." I thought about that. "So I'm looking at spending money upfront to maybe get reimbursed." "Pretty much. But you'd need documentation. Photos are good, but lab results are better. You want me to come take a look?" The next day was Saturday, and Marcus drove up from Burlington in his pickup truck. He'd brought testing kits and sampling equipment. We spent 2 hours in the cold, collecting samples from different parts of the pile and the runoff puddles. Marcus's expression grew grimmer with each sample. "This is pretty bad, Zach," he said, sealing another vial. "Look at this." He showed me an area where the melting snow had created a dark stream running toward the woods. "See that sheen? That's petroleum. And this brownish discoloration here. Likely heavy metals and sediment from brake dust. The salt content alone is probably off the charts. How bad are we talking?" "Bad enough that this shouldn't be sitting here. If this runs off into any water sources, you're looking at serious contamination. Are there any streams in those woods?" "About 100 yards back. There's a creek that feeds into the Winooski River eventually." Marcus let out a low whistle. "Then this is potentially a real problem. If contaminated runoff reaches that creek, you're talking about violations of the Clean Water Act. The state takes that seriously. We finished collecting samples, and Marcus promised to rush the analysis. He said he'd call in some favors to get results within a week, instead of the usual 2 to 3 weeks. In the meantime, I documented everything with time-stamped photographs. I measured the dimensions of the pile, noted the temperature and weather conditions, and photographed the runoff patterns. I even took aerial shots using my drone, clearly showing the scope of the dump and its proximity to my house and the woods beyond. The test results came back on a Wednesday, and they were damning. The contamination levels were significant. Petroleum hydrocarbons were present at levels well above EPA thresholds. Heavy metals including lead, cadmium, and copper were detected in concentrations that classified the material as hazardous. The chloride levels from road salt were extreme. The dissolved solids content was through the roof. Marcus sent me a detailed report along with his professional assessment. In his expert opinion, the material constituted hazardous waste and required proper remediation by a licensed contractor. He estimated the cost of professional removal and disposal at somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000, depending on the exact volume and disposal fees. I had my ammunition. Now, I needed to decide how to use it. I drafted another letter to the HOA, this time attaching the lab results and Marcus's professional assessment. I explained that the material on my property was documented hazardous waste and that they had 7 days to arrange for its proper removal by a licensed remediation company. If they failed to act, I would hire a company myself and bill them for the full cost, plus any additional damages resulting from the contamination. I sent it certified mail again, and this time I also sent copies to each board member individually at their home addresses, which were public record. I wanted to make sure they couldn't claim ignorance. 3 days later, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Brenda Morrison's number. "Hello, Zachary, this is Brenda." Her voice had lost some of its usual confidence. "I received your letter, and the board feels that you're overreacting. We spoke with our attorney, and he says that the temporary placement of snow during a weather emergency doesn't constitute illegal dumping." "Did your attorney see the lab results?" There was a pause. "He reviewed your letter." "So that's a no. Brenda, this isn't regular snow. It's contaminated with hazardous materials. I have documentation from a licensed environmental professional. If that runoff reaches the creek in my backwoods, you're looking at Clean Water Act violations. Do you understand what that means?" "I understand you're trying to bully the HOA into paying for something that's completely unnecessary." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. "I gave you 7 days. That's more than fair. If you don't arrange for removal, I'll do it myself and send you the bill." "You can send whatever bill you want. That doesn't mean we'll pay it. Then I'll file a lien against the HOA and take you to court, and I'll be filing a complaint with the Vermont DEC about the contamination. They'll want to know who's responsible for the illegal dump site." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm explaining consequences, Brenda. You dumped hazardous waste on my property without permission. That's not a gray area. Fix it, or deal with what comes next." She hung up without another word. The 7 days passed with no action from the HOA. I spent that time getting quotes from 3 different environmental remediation companies. The estimates ranged from $17,000 to $24,000. I chose a company called Green Mountain Remediation based in Montpelier. They had excellent reviews and were licensed for hazardous waste handling. I scheduled them to come out the following Monday. When I explained the situation, the owner, a guy named Tom Peterson, chuckled grimly. HOA dumped on you, huh? We see this kind of thing more than you'd think. People don't realize that road snow is nasty stuff when it's piled up like that. Can you document everything for legal purposes? Absolutely. We'll photograph everything before we start, document the volume, and provide you with a detailed report of what we removed and where it was disposed of. You'll get copies of all the disposal receipts too. Perfect. The Green Mountain remediation crew showed up Monday morning with 2 dump trucks, a front-end loader, and 4 workers in hazmat suits. The sight of people in protective gear removing the snow really drove home how contaminated it was. Neighbors started coming out to watch, and I saw more than one concerned face. Around mid-morning, Brenda's Mercedes pulled up in front of my house. She got out and marched up my driveway to where I was standing, watching the operation. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, cleaning up the hazardous waste that was illegally dumped on my property, like I said I would. "You can't do this. Watch me." The HOA isn't paying for this ridiculous charade. Tom, the company owner, walked over, pulling down his respirator mask. "Madam, this isn't a charade. This material is contaminated with petroleum products, heavy metals, and chemical pollutants. It requires proper disposal at a licensed facility. You're lucky he's handling it before it gets into the watershed, or you'd be dealing with the EPA." Brenda's face went red. "I don't know who you are, but this is none of your business. Actually, it's exactly my business. I'm the one removing the hazardous waste." He pulled out a business card and handed it to her. "Tom Peterson, Green Mountain Remediation. If you have questions about the legitimacy of this operation, feel free to call the Vermont DEC. They're aware of what we're doing here." That last part wasn't entirely true yet, but I planned to notify them as soon as the cleanup was complete. Brenda sputtered for a moment, then turned back to me. "Fine. Do what you want. But don't expect a dime from the HOA. We'll see you in court if you try to collect." "Looking forward to it," I said calmly. She stormed off and Tom shook his head. "HOA president?" "Yep. Good luck with that. Document everything, keep every receipt, and make sure you have proof they dumped it here. Already done." The cleanup took 3 days. The crew had to carefully load the contaminated snow, ensuring runoff didn't spread the pollution further. They treated the ground where the pile had been sitting, removing the top layer of contaminated soil. They even documented oil stains on some of my grass and took samples of the soil near the woods to ensure no contamination had spread. The final bill came to $21,347.62. Tom provided me with a detailed invoice, photo documentation, lab results showing what they'd removed, and disposal receipts from the licensed hazmat facility where they'd taken everything. He also included a report stating that, in his professional opinion, the contamination levels required the level of response they'd provided. I drafted an invoice to the HOA for the full amount, plus an additional $5,000 for property damage, my time spent dealing with the issue, and emotional distress. $26,347.62, due within 30 days. I included copies of all documentation. The photos of the original dump, the lab results showing contamination, the cleanup company's report and receipts, photos of the cleanup process, and a timeline of events including my 2 certified letters warning them to take action. I sent it via certified mail and also via email to every board member whose email address I could find. Then I waited. The response came faster than I expected. Within a week, I received a letter from a law firm in Burlington, Schaffer and Associates. It stated that they represented the Maple Ridge HOA and that my invoice was frivolous and would not be paid. The letter accused me of acting in bad faith, performing unnecessary work, and attempting to defraud the HOA. It threatened legal action if I continued to harass their client. I read the letter carefully, then called my own attorney, a woman named Jennifer Reynolds who I'd used when I bought my house. I explained the entire situation and sent her all my documentation. "This is pretty straightforward," Jennifer said when she called me back. "They dumped hazardous waste on your property without permission. You warned them twice, gave them opportunity to remedy the situation, and then mitigated the damage yourself when they refused. You have excellent documentation. Their attorney is posturing. So what do I do?" "We file a lawsuit in civil court for the full amount, plus court costs and legal fees. We also file a complaint with the Vermont DEC about the illegal dumping. The state might pursue their own enforcement action, which would strengthen your civil case. How long will this take?" "Civil litigation can take months, sometimes over a year, but with documentation this solid, I'd expect them to settle before it gets too far. Their attorney will advise them that they're going to lose. And if they don't settle, then we go to court and you'll likely win. A judge isn't going to look kindly on an HOA that dumped contaminated waste on someone's property and refused to clean it up." We moved forward with both the lawsuit and the complaint to the DEC. Jennifer filed the civil complaint in Vermont Superior Court, Washington County, seeking $26,347.62, plus court costs, legal fees, and punitive damages for willful trespass and illegal dumping. The complaint to the Vermont DEC was filed by me personally, with supporting documentation. I explained what had happened, provided evidence that the HOA had arranged for the dumping, and included the lab results showing the contamination levels. I also noted that I'd warned them multiple times and they'd refused to act. 3 weeks later, I got a call from an investigator with the DEC named Paul Mitchell. He wanted to come out and assess the site. I told him the contamination had been removed, but I had extensive documentation of what had been there. Paul came out on a Thursday afternoon. He was a serious-looking man in his 40s, wearing a DEC jacket and carrying a clipboard. I walked him through everything, showed him the photos, the lab results, the cleanup documentation, and the correspondence with the HOA. "This is one of the more clear-cut cases I've seen," Paul said, taking notes. "Do you know who specifically arranged for the snow to be dumped here?" "The HOA president, Brenda Morrison. She admitted it to me directly. I don't have that recorded, but I documented our conversation in writing immediately afterward with dates and times. And the HOA hired the snow removal company. Yes, I have a copy of their contract. I subpoenaed their records as part of the civil lawsuit." Paul nodded approvingly. "Good. You've done your homework. I'm going to need to interview members of the HOA board and the snow removal company. We may pursue enforcement action for illegal dumping and potential Clean Water Act violations." "What kind of penalties are we talking about?" "Depends on a lot of factors, but violations can range from a few $1,000s to tens of thousands. If there had been any contamination to the creek you mentioned, it would be much more serious." After Paul left, I felt a grim satisfaction. This wasn't just about the money anymore. Brenda and the HOA board had been dismissive, arrogant, and had violated environmental laws. They needed to face consequences. The next month was relatively quiet on the legal front. Discovery was happening in the civil case, with both sides exchanging documents. My attorney requested all HOA meeting minutes, financial records related to snow removal, contracts with the plowing company, and communications among board members regarding the dumping. What came back was illuminating. It turned out that several board members had questioned the decision to dump on my property. There were emails showing that at least 2 board members had expressed concerns about liability. Brenda had dismissed those concerns, stating in one email that I was a non-member who has never contributed to the community and needs to start being a team player. There was also documentation showing that the plowing company had specifically asked where they should dump the snow and had noted in writing that it would contain standard road contaminants. Brenda had directed them to my property in an email, stating it was available open land. Jennifer was delighted with this evidence. This shows willful action and knowledge that the material was contaminated. It's exactly what we need. In March, I received a notice that the DEC had completed their investigation and was pursuing enforcement action against the HOA for illegal dumping of contaminated material. The proposed penalty was $15,000, with an additional requirement that the HOA implement proper procedures for snow disposal and provide environmental training to board members. I also learned through Paul that the DEC had interviewed Brenda and other board members. According to Paul, Brenda had been defensive and argumentative, which hadn't helped their case. The snow removal company had cooperated fully and had actually been sympathetic, stating that they'd recommended against dumping on private property without permission, but had followed the HOA's directions. In April, settlement negotiations began in the civil case. The HOA's attorney reached out to Jennifer to discuss resolution. They offered $10,000, claiming that the cleanup costs were inflated and that I bore some responsibility for overreacting. Jennifer countered with $35,000, which included the original bill, legal fees that had been mounting, and increased punitive damages based on the evidence we'd uncovered showing willful action. They countered at $15,000. We countered at $30,000. They came back at $18,000. This went on for 2 weeks. Finally, Jennifer called me with their latest offer, $24,000, plus they would pay my legal fees separately, which had reached about $8,000. In exchange, I would drop the lawsuit and not pursue any further action. What about the DEC enforcement? I asked. That's separate. They'll still have to pay that penalty and comply with those requirements. This is just the civil settlement between you and them. I thought about it. $24,000 would cover almost all of the cleanup costs and compensate me for my time and trouble. The additional $8,000 for legal fees was fair, and the HOA would still face consequences from the state. Do I have to sign anything saying I won't talk about this? They're asking for a confidentiality clause, but I've already told them that's not happening. You have a right to discuss what happened to you. Then I'll accept. But I wanted in writing that this settlement is specifically for the illegal dumping and property damage, and that they acknowledge their responsibility. I'll make sure the settlement agreement is clear on that. The settlement was finalized in early May. I received a check for $32,000, which covered everything. The HOA also had to pay the deck's $15,000 penalty. All told, their snow dumping decision had cost them $47,000, not including their own legal fees. But the story didn't end there. In June, I attended an HOA meeting for the first time in my 5 years living there. I wasn't a member and couldn't vote, but the meetings were technically public. I wanted to see the aftermath. The meeting was held in the community center clubhouse. About 20 homeowners were there, along with the board members. Brenda sat at the head table, looking older than she had just a few months ago. The stress had clearly taken a toll. The meeting began with standard business, approving minutes and discussing routine maintenance. Then they got to the financial report, and the treasurer, a nervous-looking man named Harold, had to explain the massive, unexpected expenses. As you can see from the report, we had significant unbudgeted costs this quarter related to the snow removal incident, Harold said carefully. Between the settlement and the state penalty, we're looking at a $47,000 shortfall. Murmurs rippled through the room. "What snow removal incident?" someone called out. Harold looked at Brenda, who reluctantly stood up. She explained in the most clinical terms possible what had happened, carefully avoiding any admission that she'd been wrong. She framed it as an unfortunate misunderstanding and an overly aggressive response by a non-member. I raised my hand. Brenda's expression soured when she saw me. "Yes. I just want to clarify a few facts for the members here," I said, standing up. "The HOA, under President Morrison's direction, dumped contaminated snow on my property without permission. I warned them twice in writing that the material was hazardous and asked them to remove it. They refused. I then hired a licensed remediation company to clean it up properly. The Vermont DEC investigated and found that the HOA had illegally dumped hazardous waste. That's why there's a penalty. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate action that violated state environmental laws." Several homeowners turned to look at Brenda, who had gone red in the face. "That's your characterization," she said stiffly. "It's also the deck's characterization and the basis for the settlement you agreed to," I replied. "I have all the documentation if anyone wants to see it." A woman I didn't recognize spoke up. "Why would you dump anything on his property without asking?" "It was an emergency situation," Brenda said. "We needed to clear the roads quickly for safety." "There were other options," I said. "You could have asked me for permission, which I might have granted for clean snow. You could have found a legitimate disposal site. Instead, you chose the cheapest option and hoped I wouldn't push back. And when I did, you dismissed my concerns until it became a legal problem." More murmuring, this one decidedly unfriendly toward the board. Another homeowner, an older man, stood up. "How are we covering this $47,000 shortfall?" Harold cleared his throat. "We'll need to implement a special assessment. Each household will be billed approximately $450 to cover the shortfall." That caused an uproar. People started shouting questions, and several directed angry comments at Brenda. I sat down, satisfied. I hadn't come to gloat, just to make sure the truth was clear. The meeting devolved into chaos, and they eventually called a recess. As people filed out, several homeowners approached me, apologizing for what had happened and thanking me for standing up to the board. One woman, maybe in her 60s, shook my hand. "I'm Tessa Fairfield. I'm glad you didn't let them get away with this. Brenda's been running this HOA like a dictatorship for years. Maybe this will finally lead to some changes." "I hope so," I said. "Are you going to join the HOA now? We could use someone who actually understands property rights." I smiled. "I'll think about it." In July, there was a special election for the HOA board. Brenda didn't run for re-election, and I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she was selling her house and moving to New Hampshire to be closer to her daughter. 2 other board members also stepped down. New members were elected, including Tessa Fairfield as the new president. One of her first actions was to invite me to a board meeting to discuss my potential membership. I went, more out of curiosity than anything else. "We want to rebuild trust with you," Tessa said at the meeting. "What happened was wrong, and it never should have happened. We're implementing new procedures for any actions that might affect non-member properties, and we're requiring board approval before any major decisions like that." "I appreciate that," I said. "Would you consider joining the HOA? I understand you have grandfathered status and don't have to, but having you involved might help prevent something like this from happening again. I thought about it. Part of me wanted nothing to do with the HOA after everything that had happened. But another part recognized that being on the inside might actually give me more influence to prevent future problems, both for myself and for others. "I'll join," I said finally. "But I'm not interested in being on the board. I just want to be involved enough to know what's going on." "That's perfectly fine. We're just glad to have you as part of the community." They waived the initiation fee given the circumstances, and I started paying the quarterly HOA dues. It was a strange feeling, finally being part of the organization that had caused me so much trouble. Over the summer, my property recovered from the ordeal. The grass grew back where the soil had been removed, and I planted some native wildflowers in that area to help with erosion control. The woods showed no signs of contamination, and the creek was healthy and clear. Marcus came up to visit in August, and we walked the property together. He took some soil and water samples just to confirm everything was clean, and the results came back perfect. "You dodged a bullet here," he said as we sat on my back deck with beers, looking at the woods. "If that contamination had reached the creek, you'd have been dealing with a much bigger mess, even though it wasn't your fault." "I know. That's why I pushed so hard to get it cleaned up immediately." "Smart move. And you made them pay for their mistake. That's the important part. If there are no consequences, people like that HOA president will just keep doing whatever they want." "Brenda's gone now, sold her house and moved away." "Good riddance," Marcus said, raising his beer bottle. We clinked bottles and I smiled. It had been a stressful few months, but things had worked out. My property was clean. I'd been compensated for the damage and hassle, and the HOA had learned a very expensive lesson about respecting property rights and environmental laws. In September, I got an unexpected visitor. A man in his 30s knocked on my door one evening, introducing himself as Kevin Morrison. "I'm Brenda Morrison's son," he said. "I wanted to apologize to you in person for what my mother did." I was taken aback. "That's not necessary." "Yes, it is." I heard the whole story after everything fell apart. My mom can be really stubborn and convinced that she's always right. She shouldn't have dumped that snow on your property, and she definitely shouldn't have refused to fix it when you asked. "I'm really sorry about all the trouble she caused you." "I appreciate you saying that. How's she doing?" Kevin sighed. "Honestly, not great. She's embarrassed about the whole thing and pretty bitter. She feels like everyone turned against her, but she won't admit that she brought it on herself. I'm hoping time will give her some perspective." "Sometimes people need to face consequences before they can learn," I said. "Yeah. Anyway, I just wanted you to know that not everyone in my family thinks you were wrong for what you did. You had every right to protect your property." We shook hands and he left. It was a small moment, but it meant something. This whole situation had never been about revenge or spite. It had been about standing up for my rights and ensuring that people faced appropriate consequences for their actions. The fall came, and with it, the Vermont foliage season. My backyard, recovered from the snow dump incident, was a riot of red, orange, and yellow as the trees turned color. I hosted a small barbecue for some neighbors, including Tessa and a few other folks from the HOA. We were standing around the fire pit as the sun set, and someone brought up the snow dump incident. "I still can't believe Brenda thought that was okay," one neighbor said. "The scary thing is, she really did think it was okay," I replied. "She thought that because I wasn't part of the HOA and had all this unused land, she could just use it however she wanted. She didn't see me as having legitimate property rights." "That's the danger of people getting a little bit of power," Tessa said. "They start to think the rules don't apply to them. That's why oversight and accountability matter so much in an HOA. So what's the HOA doing differently now? Someone asked. Tessa smiled. We've implemented a bunch of new policies. Any action that affects property outside HOA common areas requires unanimous board approval. We have quarterly audits of finances by an independent accountant. Board meetings have detailed minutes that are posted publicly. And we're requiring all board members to take a certification course on property law and HOA regulations. That sounds like good changes, I said. They're changes that should have been in place all along. The previous board got lazy and let one person make too many decisions without oversight. That's how situations like yours happen. As the evening wore on and people drifted home, I stood alone in my backyard, looking at the spot where the massive snow pile had been. The grass had grown in thick and healthy. There was no sign of the contamination that had been there. It was just my yard again, peaceful and quiet. The whole ordeal had cost me time, stress, and money upfront, even though I'd ultimately been compensated. It had been months of documentation, phone calls, emails, legal meetings, and dealing with the frustration of bureaucracy. But it had been worth it, not just for the financial recovery but for the principle: property rights matter. Environmental protection matters. Accountability matters. When someone with a bit of power decides they can ignore those things, they need to be stopped. Otherwise, they'll keep doing it, and the damage will spread. Winter came around again, and with it more snow. This time, I watched carefully to see where the HOA's plowing company dumped the road snow. They'd contracted with a proper facility that could handle contaminated snow, and the HOA dues had gone up slightly to cover the additional cost. But that's what should have been done in the first place. I kept all my documentation from the incident in a fireproof safe in my office. The photos, the lab results, the legal filings, the settlement agreement. Part of me hoped I'd never need them again, but another part knew it was good to have proof of what had happened. In December, nearly a year after the original dumping, I received a holiday card from Kevin Morrison. Inside was a brief note saying that his mother was doing better and had started volunteering with an environmental conservation group in New Hampshire, of all things. He thought I might appreciate the irony. I did. I also got a card from Tessa and the HOA board, thanking me for my participation in the community and wishing me happy holidays. It was a small thing, but it represented how much had changed in a year. Looking back on everything, I realized that the key moments had been the decisions to document everything thoroughly and to not back down when Brenda tried to dismiss my concerns. If I'd let it go, if I'd decided it wasn't worth the fight, that contaminated snow would have sat there all spring, melting toxic runoff into the ground and potentially into the creek. And Brenda would have learned that she could use my property however she wanted without consequences. Instead, she learned a very expensive lesson. The HOA learned that actions have consequences, and the neighborhood got better leadership that understood the importance of accountability. My life returned to normal, or as normal as it gets in Vermont. I went to work every day, maintained my house, enjoyed my property, and occasionally attended HOA meetings to stay informed. I never had another serious conflict with the HOA, though there were occasional minor disagreements about things like landscaping standards or parking rules. But those were handled professionally and resolved through proper channels. The following February, exactly 1 year after the dumping incident, we had another major snowstorm. I watched the plowing trucks clear Maple Ridge Drive, and I saw them continue on to the approved disposal site instead of turning toward my property. It was a small satisfaction, but a meaningful one. I took a photo of my clean, snow-covered backyard and sent it to Marcus with the caption, "1 year later, still dump-free." He replied, "You set a precedent, man. I guarantee other HOAs in Vermont heard about what happened and are being more careful now." That thought made me smile. Maybe something good had come from all the hassle. Maybe other property owners would be spared similar situations because the HOA community had learned that this kind of behavior came with serious consequences. In March, I was pulling weeds in my garden when Tessa stopped by, walking her dog along the street. We chatted for a few minutes about neighborhood news, and she mentioned that the HOA had just paid off the special assessment early. We had better than expected income from some investments, and the board voted to apply it to the assessment balance. Everyone's happy to have that behind us. "That's good," I said. "Water under the bridge." "Speaking of water," Tessa said, "I heard the state recognized you for your environmental complaint, something about their citizen watchdog program." "Oh, that." "Yeah, the DEC sent me a certificate thanking me for reporting environmental violations. It's just a piece of paper." "It's more than that. It's recognition that you did the right thing, even when it was difficult and expensive. A lot of people wouldn't have pushed as hard as you did." After she walked on, I thought about that. She was probably right. It would have been easier to let it go, to accept the snow dump and deal with the consequences later. But easier isn't always better. Sometimes you have to stand up and fight, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, because that's the only way things actually change. As spring progressed, and my yard came back to life with flowers and green grass, I found myself grateful for how everything had turned out. My property was healthy and clean. The HOA was functioning better under new leadership. The environment had been protected from potential contamination. And a lesson had been taught about respecting property rights and environmental laws. The invoice I'd sent to the HOA, $26,347.62, had been more than just a bill. It had been a statement that actions have prices, that you can't just do whatever you want without consequences, and that property rights matter even when dealing with someone who isn't part of your organization. I'd framed a copy of the settlement check and hung it in my office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder to document everything. A reminder to stand up for your rights. A reminder that persistence matters. And a reminder that sometimes the fight is worth it, even when it's exhausting and expensive and frustrating. On a warm evening in late May, I sat on my back deck with a beer, looking at the woods where the creek flowed clean and clear. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Birds were singing in the trees. Everything was peaceful. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister in Boston. She'd heard about the situation months ago and had been following the resolution. "Hey, saw your Facebook post about your garden. Looks great. Glad everything worked out with the HOA thing. You handled it like a boss." I texted back, "Thanks. It was a pain, but worth it." That pretty much summed it up. It had been a pain, a major one, but it had been worth it. For my property, for the environment, for the principle, and maybe for other people who would benefit from the precedent that had been set. As darkness fell and the stars came out, I finished my beer and headed inside. Tomorrow was Monday, back to work, back to regular life. The snow dump incident was behind me, resolved and completed. My property was mine again, clean and protected. The HOA had learned their lesson. Justice had been served. And if another HOA in Vermont was thinking about dumping contaminated snow on someone's property without permission, they now had a very expensive cautionary tale to consider first. Sometimes that's the best outcome you can hope for. Not just resolving your own situation, but making things a little bit better for everyone who comes after. I slept well that night, and in the morning, I looked out my kitchen window at my backyard, clean and green and exactly as it should be. No mountains of toxic snow, no contamination, no trespassing. Just my property, my land, my rights respected and protected. It had been one hell of a fight, but I'd won, and that made all the difference.